Well, hey there, everybody. It's good to see you again, and glad you could be back to join me today. We are in week 2 of our stay-at-home order here in Michigan, and my guess is many of you are starting to go a little stir-crazy. You probably have been ordered to work from home if you're able to, and we're in this situation because of this virus. And what our leaders have felt is necessary to try to stop it, or to, flatten the curve, as they tell us over and over and over again. And it's a difficult time. I don't mean to gloss that over in any way. It's a struggle in a lot of different ways. A lot of people are experiencing physical pain. A lot of people are experiencing financial pain. A lot of people are experiencing emotional struggles, spiritual struggles. As chaplain, I read up on things and I get reports that in a lot of places, law enforcement are seeing a 25% or higher increase in domestic disturbance calls because people are cooped up together and they're stuck together. And I just saw a news article a couple days ago talking about how you can survive in this situation of being around your significant other or your spouse or your family on a regular basis. And that can be tough. And people can be getting a combination of all those things. Well, because of that, a couple weeks ago, we started our study of Joseph and looking at his life, because he was someone who saw a lot of difficult times that came about really out of no fault of his own. And I think it relates to this whole coronavirus, because it's not our fault that this came around. It's not our fault that it's going on. We didn't do something in that sense. There's a whole nother discussion we could have about the sin of our nation. But in terms of an individual, it wasn't my choice that brought this virus here. And so Joseph saw these things out of no fault of his own, these struggles. And so we've been looking at his life, and I'll give you a little full disclosure here. These little devotionals are adapted from a sermon series I did several years ago about Joseph. And that series was based in part on a book by Max Lucado called You'll Get Through This. I showed you that in the first video of this series. But last time with Joseph, so let's get brought up to speed. Last time we see Joseph going out to meet his brothers. He was doing what his dad told him to, and he was just going to check up on them out in the field. And they see him coming because of that super bright coat. And they start planning what they're going to do, because they hated him. In fact, they hate him so much that they wanted to kill him. And they then plot how they're going to do it. And Joseph gets over to them. They grab him. They rip that robe off him. And they toss him down into the pit. Remember last time we talked about him being tossed into that pit. And he is laying there either naked or in his underwear. We don't know which. Either way, embarrassed and hurt, because this thing was 10, 20, 30 feet deep, maybe more. And he's down at the bottom. And he's hearing his brothers discuss over dinner what they're going to do. And he hears most of their discussion being centered around how they're going to kill him and get rid of his body. That's quite a mess to be sitting in. And there would be quite a bit of fear involved in that. He did have one brother, Reuben, who was gone at the time, because he had hoped that he could get them to do what they did with Joseph, and he would come back later and save him and get him out. We read in the story later, he came back, Joseph was gone. We're not at that point yet, but Joseph is laying there in this pit in a mess. Now we're going to do something a little bit different this time. We're going to jump forward in the story. For those of you that enjoy going to the end of the book and reading the end of the book before you read the entire book, you're cheaters. But we're going to do that today anyway. We're going to jump 20 years later. All right? And so in this situation, the brothers have changed quite a bit. If you want to get on scripture with us, we're going to be in Genesis chapter 50. before we go back to Genesis chapter 37 and 38 next week. And so here they are. They're standing in front of the second most powerful man in the world. So Egypt, this is where Joseph is. Egypt is the most powerful empire in the world at the time. And Pharaoh, thus, is the most powerful man in the world. And Joseph is second in command. So he is second only to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh, at this point, as we'll see later on in the story, has given Joseph all the power. He can basically do whatever he wants, unless the Pharaoh tells him not to. But the Pharaoh's given him authority to do this. And so if they're standing in front of him, his brothers are standing in front of Joseph, and they are scared to death. They're scared to death because their dad has died. They are convinced that Joseph now is going to exact his revenge for what they did to him. Well, Joseph shocks their pants off, or their robes. You know, they would have had robes on. He shocked them off, and we look at verse 20 in chapter 50 here, and it says, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good." Excuse me. "He brought me to this position so I could save the lives of many people." Now here is a man who has had difficulties throughout his life. He went from that pit to being a slave, from a slave to working in a house, from working in a house as a slave, to being falsely accused of a crime, to being put in prison for years before being forgotten and finally brought before Pharaoh with the pressure of his life ending if he doesn't interpret the dream right. We'll get to all that over the next several weeks, but this is where he's at. And I just want to share what Max Lucado says in his book about this, about his life, because Joseph connected himself, tied himself to this promise that we see in verse 20, that God has used all of this for good, that all these struggles and pains and trials are brought to him. And he said this: Joseph tied himself to the pillar of this promise and held on for dear life. Nothing in his story glosses over the presence of evil. Quite the contrary. Blood stains, tear stains are everywhere. Joseph's heart was rubbed raw against the rocks of disloyalty and miscarried justice. Yet time and time again, God redeemed the pain. The torn robe became a royal one. The pit became a palace. The broken family grew old together. The very acts intended to destroy God's servant turned out to strengthen him. God wove this planned evil, all these difficult things, these tough times, into good. In fact, they were instrumental and crucial in his overall plan for the nation of Israel. And he wove it all for good. He turned all of those difficult situations into good. And there are lots of passages in the Bible that tell us that God is in control and he will succeed in his plans no matter what we face, no matter what comes before us. Job 42:2 says, "I know that you can do anything and no one can stop you." Psalm 115:3, "Our God is in the heavens and he does as he wishes." Isaiah 14:27, "The Lord of heaven's armies has spoken. Who can change his plans? When his hand is raised, who can stop him?" Daniel 4:35, "All the people of the earth are nothing compared to him. He does as he pleases among the angels of heaven and among the people of the earth. No one can stop him or say to him, 'What do you mean by doing these things?' No one can challenge him. He is in control. There is nothing happening on this earth that he doesn't know about." Nothing is happening in your life. Nothing is happening in our community. Nothing is happening in this state or country or world that isn't ordained by him. While this attribute of God can be difficult to deal with in light of evil, in light of struggles, in light of innocent children or babies, that's an entirely different conversation from this. What I want you to get is that he's in control of what happens in our lives. And I want you to take comfort in that. Take comfort in knowing that no matter what we face, there is someone infinitely more powerful who is watching and who is active. I am not a deist, and I am assuming that if you are watching this, you're not a deist. If you are, I encourage you to read the scriptures to understand how God is intimately involved in the existence and the functioning of this universe. That nothing can go on without him. His power sustains it. Even if you think of this universe as being billions and billions and billions of years old, which I don't, but say you do, the natural laws would tell us that the universe would have imploded by now. It would have run out of energy to continue to exist if not for God. And so I want you to take comfort in knowing that he is involved. He's in control. And we see Joseph cling to the promise that God is in control. He clung to it his entire life. Every time he turned around, something was going wrong. And I know that there's someone watching this that feels like every time they turn around, something has gone wrong. That maybe everything and everyone is against them. But when we look at Scripture, we find encouragement. What we find is that we have God the Spirit dwelling in us, being in our soul, in our mind, in our heart, and our lives when we are adopted into his family as believers. I think we have a greater promise to cling to, and that is God is in us and he's giving us eternity with him. No matter what happens in this world, no matter how it turns out, no matter how this whole virus thing ends, God is in control. And if I am a follower of him, if I'm a disciple of Christ, if he has forgiven me and I'm adopted into his family, then if I die, I actually gain. If things go south, I get to be in heaven with him forever. And so I want you to remember the principle in verse 20, the principle that probably a lot of pastors are sharing with people right now, Romans 8:28. And I pray that they are sharing it the proper way, because those apply to all those who love God and are his adopted children. Romans 8:28 says that he is making all things turn out for good. But he says something very critical there, for those who love him. Isaiah 26:3 talks about the peace that we have in God. And in that he says, all those whose thoughts are fixed on him. Are your thoughts fixed on him today? Are you focused on God? If you live in Michigan, or I think I heard just on the way here today, a couple dozen states where you're told to stay home, you have plenty of time to fix your thoughts on God. So are they? When our thoughts are fixed on him, we can cling to the hope that no matter what happens in our lives, no matter what happens to us, we have the God of the universe on our side. He doesn't promise that we win over the struggles, other than he promises we will be with him forever. And that whatever is happening in our lives, he will use for his glory. So cling to that hope the same as Joseph did. That no matter what happens, God will use it for his glory. I'm praying for you today. I'm praying that you are clinging to that hope. I'm praying that he's giving you a peace that only he can give. That whenever you hear the news, turn the news off for a while. Give yourself a break. And turn to God. And let him take care of it all. As I like to say, be a blessing and be blessed. God loves you.